All right, so I'm doing what I've asked others to do today. It's been a while, but it's a lovely fall day in Philadelphia, and I connected with someone online who was visiting town because I was sort of plaintive about wanting to have company. And so this visitor, I'm showing this person around Philadelphia today, and I actually, it's amazing that when you sort of get yourself in the right mindset, all of these stories fall into place. So I'm on Girard Avenue. Girard Avenue it's about a 15-20 minute bus ride from my house. I just live just south of Girard Avenue. We're over on the east side of town. I'm more on the west side of town. And we're at the shrine of St. John Newman. And St. John Newman was a Bohemian priest who was the first male canonized as a saint in the United States. And he came in the 1830s during sort of a financial crisis, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on 3rd Street. But he was a German-speaking priest, and he came into New York and spent a lot of his time in upstate New York, in rural cabins, and then eventually went down to Maryland and was appointed Bishop of Philadelphia in 1952. And and he died pretty young in 1840. He died at the age of 48. Sorry about that. He died at the age of 48. Evidently, he worked really hard, and he only wore one pair of boots, according to the Wikipedia article. But the key thing here that I wanted to point out was, we talked a lot about religious code and the word and collective behavior and civilizing forces, and part of what I wanted to talk about in California was the mission system. And this is, not to throw shade on the Catholic Church, but just to have us reflect about institutions and if they actually are benefiting the least of us. And so so St. John Newman, it's important that he started the Catholic school system. And in Philadelphia, in the education space, there's a lot of controversy about vouchers and applying public funds to private schools, including the Catholic schools. And one of the important things to know in Philadelphia, as many of the parishes have shrunk and many of the parish schools closed, that there was a new kind of mission school system that was independent of neighborhood parishes that sprung up. And they sprung up largely in low-income neighborhoods where a lot of the public schools were closed, and they were no longer attached to the parishes. They were part of this larger mission system, and they were connected to often work-based learning. And so families that didn't have much money, even though Catholic education is less expensive than many other kinds of private education, it was still a cost to the family, even with scholarships. So, low-income families went from not having access to public schools that were, you could question how functional they were or not, to having those schools closed and their primary options being these mission schools with work-based learning, because a lot of the scholarships came with work-based components. And I'm going to touch on that later when we get down to Workman Place and Octavia Hill. So I'm just going to pause for a second and head around the corner. Okay, so I just walked around the corner, and you can see sort of this is the cathedral or the shrine. I guess there's some remains of John Newman here. And, so I was talking about the mission schools and the work-based learning, because I think that's going to be the social conditioning for the metaverse and also work-based learning. And it's going to be linked to vouchers and the educational savings accounts. And so I think that's all important to have that context. The other thing I wanted to mention, so we just went into the building, and we walked in, and they actually were having mass at the lower level. It's a Saturday. They were having their Saturday mass. And as we walked in, we heard the sermon, and they were actually talking about the Pharisees. And so, the Pharisees were, a religious group that felt themselves to be very much about following the rules and following the law. And I think the parable of the Pharisees is that you think of yourself as being better than other people because you are following God's law in the way that is being expected. And the parable of the Pharisees was that there was a tax collector praying alongside the Pharisee, and the Pharisee was sort of doing this sort of backwards compliment to himself, like that, you know, he fasted and he tithed, and he was certainly a much better person than the tax collector. But the tax collector essentially had put himself in the mercy of God. And Jesus was saying, like, actually the tax collector is better off than the person who feels like they're following all the rules and that they're better than everyone, but in their heart they're actually kind of far from God. And so I think this has a lot to do with social impact finance and this idea of sort of fake do-gooderism, not fake, maybe people who are doing the do-gooderism really do believe that they're doing the right thing, but maybe they're not doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it to be seen as the good people, to have the boxes checked so that they have good works on the book, so that when their time comes that their ledger will be full of things that on the surface seemed right, seemed charitable, but were not done with an open heart and from a godly place. And so I thought it was really interesting that sometimes you show up in the world with a certain intention and the world gives you a message, and the message was, hey, we should be thinking about the Pharisees, because what is it like in a world of need to be the one that follows all the rules, but actually that your heart is in alignment with the right thing. And I feel like in very much the whole field of social entrepreneurship is baked into that, that is what social entrepreneurship is about. And so there were a number of statues outside the sanctuary, including John Paul II. And you know, I'm going to get to this part, or actually I think I maybe just read it in my blog post about Mondragon and Focolare and Chiara Lubin and the role of sort of the reconstruction of Poland after the falling of, you know, the Soviet Union and Pope John Paul II and Vatican II, and sort of the opening up of this Focolare movement, which is all about sort of haul-ons in my understanding, and creating groundwork for social entrepreneurship and the right kind of education. So I'm just going to pause for a second because there's a motorcycle at the stoplight and it's a little loud. So I just wanted to touch again on Pope John Paul II and the role of Vatican II. And you know, when I went to Salt Lake City, the Cathedral of the Magdalene had 2 windows that were added in honor of Vatican II, and one was about aligning with the modern world, and that was represented by the United Nations sign symbol in a stained glass window, and the other was ecumenicalism. And I think that's something that's been worked on for probably 100 years, sort of the overall ecumenical movement. And when I've been doing my research around DHOC and the United Religions International, the URI, and this movement to unite all faiths, again, I don't want antagonism among faiths, but I do believe that this ecumenical movement is going to be embedded within the smart contract layer of all faiths, not just Judeo-Christian faiths, but that it is going to come with this observance of law. And then I would ask folks to reflect on the fact that we walked into this space, we heard this Mass in progress about the Pharisees and that their adherence to law but without a good heart. In many respects, like to me, that feels like AI and the outside-in robot is the ultimate Pharisee, right? Is part of that, what I talked about yesterday, the Joseph Smith view of Satan's proposal, you know, that predated Genesis, the proposal that everyone would go to heaven because everyone would be good. And this idea of if we live under the rule of law of the AI, sort of the fake promise of optimization of humanity, but that optimization actually means that we end up caught in the metaverse mind file program, which is a simulation and will never be alive and never be living and loving, even though it will try really hard to use us as an armature to get there. So anyway, those are my few comments for the St. John Newman Shrine. The first male saint in the United States, the father of the North American parochial school system, the Pharisee parable Mass, the Pope John Paul II, and I did leave, I'll take a picture and I'll put it in. At the base of his statue, I left a heart. A friend of a friend had made these lovely hand-sewn hearts, and I'll show some more of those later. A red heart at his feet with some dandelion and a feather, and some white, lovely flowers that my friend Cliff had sent to me as to sort of cheer me up. So the peace. Let us come to a peaceful resolution, sidestepping the outside-in robot of the Pharisee legal structure. And what's interesting is that the flowers that were there at the base of that statue of John Paul II were celosia. They were red celosia, and celosia are the brains, these bright red brains. And so again, this thing would like to get into our brain and into our soul with their soul-bound tokens, but we don't have to do it. We can tell another story. We can totally tell a different story. So, stop number 1. Okay. So I'm in, there's an exhibit on John Newman, and again, Newman, right, here. And I just wanted to point out, I forgot to mention previously, he actually, before he decided to become a priest, was very interested in science and plants, actually, too. And this includes a collection of his a microscope. It says from the 1850s. His fascination with scientific subjects ranged from cellular biology to botany. It is represented by this microscope, which once belonged to Dr. Lawrence Fiske, a noted Philadelphian physician and pioneer in the study of tuberculosis. And so it wasn't actually his microscope, but it represents the scientific interest that he had. And it's important to know, we've talked a bit about code and books and law and encoding. So this is the first Catholic Bible that was printed in North America, and it was printed by Matthew Carey, and it was printed in connection with Ben Franklin. So, that's interesting to note in terms of the Catholic Bible. And then just to also touch on the fact that there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment when von Neumann was doing his ministering, and riots in Philadelphia against largely the Irish, and a lot of that was about also immigrants and labor, and the disruption of the labor cycle. So, which is something that we're definitely going to be approaching again with automation and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, there's an emphasis on sort of the church being persecuted. And then here's a book about botany. I guess just to sort of touch on the fact that he was interested in science as well as religion. So, but that aspect of him being here when the Catholics were not welcome is important. And then just in closing, I was curious about this chair over here in the corner. So this chair, evidently, when Pope John Paul II visited Philadelphia in 1979, he paid a visit to the cathedral downtown, but also to the shrine of John Newman. And so that was the chair that he sat in. And I guess when he prayed, this was the pillow that he prayed on. And so now that it says that these are relics. So anyway, those are sort of the main points that I wanted to hit home here, was the science, the persecution of Catholic immigrants, and just a direct connection to the Pope. Okay, so we took the 57 bus down 4th Street, and now we're in Queen Village, which is a very old neighborhood of Philadelphia. We're not far from the Delaware River. The sky over there, you can kind of see where it's all open and empty. That's the river itself, and there's a little bit of urban renewal. This whole neighborhood was essentially led to fall down during the 19th and a lot of the 20th century. It's part of the 7th Ward, and during that era, it was historically black. Although in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, throughout, up to the Civil War, we're on the water, so there was a lot of mercantile business and things related to the shipping and exchange. So we're just south of Head House, which is, it's now a farmer's market, but it was a mercantile exchange as well. So we're at this location that is actually called Octavia Hill, Workman's Place, run by the Octavia Hill Association. And you can see, here's the Octavia Hill Association. This used to be able to walk in this courtyard, but now they have this big gate up, and it's a gated community, right? Workman Place courtyard, gated community. So you can't get in unless you have the right code. But it used to be available that people could actually go in and see. but you can sort of see from the distance, these are quite old buildings, late 18th, early 19th century buildings, quite lovely in there. You can see some of the Halloween decorations still in place. And I put down a little offering here. So we're just inside the gate, Workman Place, 1748. And this is the offering I'm leaving. So today I don't have as many items to make hearts themselves. And so I'm using these lovely gifted hand-sewn hearts from a friend of a friend. So it seemed like denim was perfect for workmen. And so I am leaving some natural materials, and here are some more flowers in white flowers of peace from my friend Cliff. And I was sent a lovely little package with some dried flowers. I'm trying to remember which flowers they were. Yellow, like goldenrod, and some cypress balls and some acorns. And this is an assortment of acorns because actually Eve, who did the zine for us, she also collected some things around the city when she was here last. And so they're all sort of mixed together, but there's milkweed pods from Bartram's garden and the paired little mussel shell from the garden. And the package that came with the cypress pods and the acorns and the goldenrod was wrapped in it was a lovely little box, and the tissue was hummingbirds. And so I cut out the hummingbirds, and I'm going to leave those along. And you can see there's a couple of bits of pottery from the Schuylkill River. We're over on the other side of town. We're on the Delaware, which is the much bigger river. So I'm leaving a few offerings, and I think these are still some of my Rochester dandelions, and they just keep going, and they're still beautiful in their seeds. So maybe some of the dandelions will find their way into the cracks. So why did I decide to come to Workman Place? There's several reasons, and I've always been charmed by this courtyard, but it's not just a charming courtyard. It's actually because it represents this idea of the ways in which this emergent structure of domination will lull you in by telling you a story that is a nice story that is not the full truth. And so this community here was essentially established in the mid-19th century by two Quaker women, and they were looking to the social reform teachings in England of a woman named Octavia Hill. Now, Octavia Hill was the 10th child of a corn merchant who was a banker that ran into financial problems. His third, and he actually followed the model of Robert Owen, who was a utopian socialist. So these folks were sort of the enlightened predecessor, those who preceded the Fabians. In the later 19th and early 20th century, the people who preceded were these Enlightenment thinkers, and Robert Owen was among them. So Octavia Hill's father was about that. And so he was working on this utopian socialism, but it's still embedded within the financial structure. The two women who worked on that, and let me just see, their names are, they were Quaker, and let's see, so the association was founded in 1896. So actually it's more later 19th century. And the two women were Quaker themselves. And the reality is that, we're told a certain story in Philadelphia of what the Quakers were, but they're actually really supportive of slavery, like on the front end, and some of they said that they were against slavery, but George Fox, and the leader of the Quaker movement, were cultivating all of the folks in the Caribbean, in Barbados, who were holding these major slave plantations and just sort of acting as if slavery was the same as indentured servitude, and they were doing a good job because they were Christianizing people who had been stolen from their homelands in Africa. Like, that's the positionality of George Fox in this, and that's a really different story. And we understand that the Barclays and these other families in English finance were actually working behind the scenes to finance the slave trade. So maybe there weren't that many Quakers who actively held slaves, but their financial interests and their evangelistic interests were very much intertwined with downplaying how terrible slavery was and pretending that it was okay. And and then just moving on as if nothing big, let's just continue to grow our ministry. And that is ultimately the Pharisee problem, is that when we imagine that we are of God and following certain rules and that we are better than others, we can proceed in this fashion, which is now integrated in with social reform and privatized welfare. Okay, so I was looking for the names of the two Quaker women who were looking to Octavia Hill as the model, and it was Hannah Fox and Helen Parrish. So I was mistaken. It wasn't mid-19th century, it was late, so 1890s. And so a lot of these buildings, this is about real estate development, really, and redevelopment and finding revenue streams. And so what these two women said was, okay, so we'll clean up, like our goal is we renovate. We don't just build new, we renovate, and we will create clean living spaces, hygienic, because this is part of the sanitary movement, and we will rent them to people, and then we will guarantee our investors a 4% rate of return. So this is like the total earliest impact finance scheme tied to housing first. Only the people who they screened to live in the houses, they said they could not have carpets or wallpaper. Everything had to be like white-walled and scrubbed clean. And that they would have folks come to collect the weekly rent, and they prided themselves on the friendly rent collectors. They were the friendly ones, but they were the earliest social workers. And so they would actually take, if they found any alcohol in the house, they would actually take it out of the house. So folks had to live in sort of what was deemed to be a sanitary pod environment with your friendly checking in social worker. And if you were caught to be not behaving, your things were taken away. And meanwhile, there is an investment stream coming to private investors. Often, the Quakers were had a lot of money, and it was all framed as do-gooderism. And so this is what we're dealing with now, in my opinion. Like, this is actually our problem, is we're living in a story that there's a whole group of people who are Pharisees, and they're pretending like they're the good ones, but actually, the story they're living in may tell themselves that they're the do-gooders, but it's more complicated, and it's about investing. So this organization still exists. If you look online, the reviews for the housing conditions are not great. And they've actually partnered with an entity called Youth Build. And Youth Build is essentially a workforce training program for students who have fallen out of the traditional education program. And the idea, again, sounds great on the surface, is you bring in young people, maybe they've had trouble with the judicial system, maybe they're homeless, maybe they just got fed up with education, maybe they had special needs that weren't met in the schools, and so they're doing a work-based learning program for opportunity youth. These are called opportunity youth, to redevelop real estate for, again, ostensibly social welfare work. Now, this started in, hold on a second. Okay, so Youth Build started in earlier, before, actually not earlier. So Youth Build started in 1978, and it was in East Harlem. There was a woman named Dorothy Stoneman, was doing social work in East Harlem, and she asked the young people what they wanted to do to improve their community, and they said that we'd like to take empty buildings back from drug dealers and renovate them. So this core program started in 78. It became citywide in New York in 84. Then it spread nationally by 88. And essentially by 1992, they had a federal funding stream that was bipartisan, because again, impact finance is appealing to both the conservatives and the liberals. And they were training people to renovate homes. Now, I'm just asking you what this looks like when, at this point, Blackstone is the largest provider of housing, private homeowner rentals in the country. And when we're looking at terrible affordable housing crises, and we're asking people to live in tiny houses and casitas, and how the casitas might fit in with this legacy of the sanitary movement, and your friendly rent collector who may ultimately be a cyber-physical system AI. And often I talk about the short story called The Domestic Front, and The Domestic Front is exactly about that your house becomes your social worker and welfare provider and your jailer, essentially. And it's funny, when I showed up here, and there was someone getting a package, and we sort of initially asked if we could maybe go in and see the courtyard, but it was fine. But I said, yeah. She's like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, we're telling stories about the history of the smart city movement. And guess what? Like that access panel over there is part of the smart city movement, even though it's glommed onto an 18th century structure that was redeveloped in the 1890s, right? This thing didn't just show up with whatever Klaus Schwab, whatever story want to tell. So what does Pay for Success Finance, which is a finance stream to become self-sustaining that Youthfield is putting forward, what does that look like when you have housing first programs that are managed by cyber-physical systems and churches and Blackstone, and that Blackstone is also collecting your DNA? And what does that look like when it's not just the lady showing up to take your whiskey bottle, but it's someone actually checking your smart toilet? Because that was part of what they did in the 1890s, was they installed indoor plumbing. So, okay, what is this next version? It's Stanford smart toilet tied to your genomic sequencing, and the smart rent collector is going to tell you what you're allowed to eat. Is that where we're going? So we should really think really hard, and we should think of what it looked like and where this thing came from. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is I made this map, and when I get home, I'll show it to you online, and I'll feed it in. But it's talking about Octavia Hill's father, who was interested. He was the corn merchant and failed banker, but he was interested in sort of utopian socialism, and this again fed into the Fabians. He was an admirer of a gentleman named Robert Owen. Now, Robert Owen was a utopian socialist. Now, it doesn't have to be socialism, because what I'm saying is this is going to be woven into the churches, the government, the corporations. It's like the trifecta of all these things coming together. So it doesn't matter if you call it socialism or totalitarianism or fascism. It's the domination principle. So Robert Owen was a utopian socialist and a free thinker. He married the daughter of a man named David Dale. David Dale was a Scottish textile guy. Now, we just had the conversation about the Lowell textile mills and luring the young women off the farm to work in the textile mills. And, it was a dangerous and sort of brutal place and involved a lot of child labor. Robert Owen, the son-in-law, really was working on this New Lanark mill town. And he was promoting, guess what? The moral economy. It's the stuff that I just talked about last night. The moral economy. And he was doing that through non-traditional payments, labor vouchers. In 1820, Robert Owen was promoting company scrip, but he was trying to frame it as a cooperative. And essentially, he's still considered the father of the cooperative movement in the United Kingdom. So when you talk about telling a story where people who become ensnared in your system somehow are led to believe that they're empowered by the system, that's what's going on, right? They're like, let me tell you a story that this is a cooperative. Let me tell you a story that this labor voucher isn't actually company store script that we can control. Let me tell you that character education, because they controlled the social programming, the social life of the mill towns, the education, the faith practice, they controlled all aspects of the civilizing progress of this town. Let me tell you that moral education is making you better, and let me ask you to ask for that, right? To be moralized within the structure that we laid out. And this guy actually had an interest in spiritualism and Mesmer and Swedenborg. So, the Carnegie is the huge force behind this, and again, Scottish links between Carnegie and Swedenborgianism, right? And the realms. So if we can get a handle on people's material bodies and control them in a spiritualized way through moral economics and character, this is what we're talking about. Now, the other interesting thing is that Alexander King, who is a Scottish biochemist and involved in the OECD, he was the science director for the OECD back in the day. He was actually the president of the Club of Rome. So Alexander King, the Scottish biochemist and president of Club of Rome, was descended from David Dale, the father-in-law of Robert Owen in Scotland. So we've gone full circle, right? The limits to growth, scarcity, austerity, cybernetics, planet Earth as a spaceship that we all have to cooperate in order for things to continue to move forward. But in that cooperation, we need to use labor vouchers and a variety of colored tokens to moralize ourselves, to show our values, to show our human potential within the construct of both the cybernetic work system, and then increasingly, like within Octavia Hill, this cybernetic system of housing and housing first. So I hope you can see how these things all fit together, but you'd never know that a 1748 building with late 19th century sort of paternalist ideas like paternalism, like whether that's socialism or libertarianism, links in again up to, like we can imagine, the encoding. You know, all of this came about after John Newman's day, you know, when he died in the...
Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment to insert a little bit of extra information from the site visit today, because I had printed out copies of these maps, but I didn't have a chance to really go into any detail. So I'm going to put this in for some additional material. Octavia Hill was connected to this settlement movement. The settlement movement is really important because I believe it's connected to sort of the Anglican Church and this idea of that began in the early 20th century of ecumenicalism, and that this new ecumenicalism is going to be a way of uniting faith communities around the world into this sort of common cause of reforming humanity into sort of molding human consciousness into some sort of collective computable machine readable material. And it's going to happen through the delivery of social welfare and programmed benefits. And that probably all of the faith communities around the world are aware, at least at the top, that this may be coming. And I think it is an outgrowth directly of this settlement movement in the United States. I mean, sorry, not the United States, in the United Kingdom. And so, but there's this interplay, right? So Octavia Hill was a social reformer in the United Kingdom, and then she influenced social reformers here in the United States in the form of the folks who were setting up the Octavia Hill Association for Housing. So I'm just going to go over to the map. I'm starting with this Toynbee tiles. You might be sort of surprised at, like, why do I have these images on the page? Toynbee tiles were sort of an iconic thing in Philadelphia. For many years, they were in the pavement of the street, and this gentleman, he did a film about it. I think, I'm not sure what his name is, Justin, about the secret of these resurrect, the Toynbee tiles. And they were some sort of linoleum, and they were actually put into the street. And they generally said Toynbee idea in movie 2001, Resurrect Dead on Planet Jupiter. And, you know, I found that quite interesting, because who is Toynbee? And Toynbee is connected to the settlement movement. And it turns out that Ocean Protocol, that is developing all of the impact data, is sort of gathering it all up in something called Jupiter Notebooks, which is quite interesting. And if we sort of imagine, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later with Cliff, on the other map, that maybe this idea of mind files, which is pretty much what Trent McConaughey of Ocean Protocol has sort of posited, that for interplanetary space travel, we would do it as some sort of digital filing system. The 2001 A Space Odyssey of resurrecting the dead, and, you know, the dead, I will say, you know, the one person who had talked about doing that was Lincoln Cannon of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and he actually had a talk about how to raise the dead. And this was quite a while ago, but this is a presentation that he did in the 2019 conference at the Mormon Transhumanist Association. We weren't at that one, but it stuck with me, like this idea that maybe God has given humanity technology and is waiting around for us to use it, and part of it is resurrecting the dead, and it is but through collection of data, organizing data, and maybe blockchain mind files, and where that all plays into the grand scheme or story. So we have this idea of the Toynbee tiles and planet Jupiter, and what is going on with these tiling systems. Who is Arthur Toynbee? And I think he was connected to the social reform movement. And is this 2001: A Space Odyssey this idea that maybe we resurrect the dead and we do interplanetary travel through Jupiter notebooks and ocean protocol and impact finance? I'm only making speculation, but there are many people who've tried to figure out what happened here, and with these tiles, and what they mean, and people don't really know what they mean, and so they're trying to figure it out. They're trying to figure out what the options are, and for me, I think a lot of it lies in understanding what actually Arthur Toynbee was, what his idea was, and anyway, so that's the Toynbee part. So now I'm going to get to the mapping part. So this is one of these maps that I've made. I made it a bit ago, probably 6 or 8 months ago. And I kind of crammed a whole lot of information in here. It's really crowded. And so because I hadn't planned on inserting this story about the settlement movement inside, and maybe one day I'll do a better job of it, but I haven't done it yet. So Arnold Toynbee. Okay, so we're going to go zoom back in. Arnold Toynbee was a world historian, and he was involved in something called the Charity Aid Society. And later on, the Charity Aid Foundation actually has been developing plans for blockchain, and positing this idea of having a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, to distribute aid. And that would be through smart contracting mechanisms and through digital identity. But this was way after Arnold Toynbee. And he was also a historian. So if you understand this idea of going back and forth in time and digitizing everything and sort of bringing yourself to certain points in time or certain memories and changing your view, inhabiting another person's body, experiencing what that's like, it would all come from this giant chronology of time, which is what Arnold Toynbee did. Now, he was named after his uncle, the other Arnold Toynbee, who was an economic historian and a lecturer, and he died young, and essentially a hall in the settlement movement was named after him, this Toynbee Hall. It was a settlement house where sort of well-heeled young men from the university would go and sort of learn about poverty. And it was set up by this gentleman, Samuel Barnett, who was an Anglican social reformer, and his wife. And her name was Harriana Octavia Rowland Barnett. And so they were social reformers. They set up this university settlement movement in which they brought, pretty well-situated young men into East London, which was highly impoverished, so that they could learn about poverty and network with one another and then move on. And in some ways, it reminds me sort of the Teach for America model, right? You take people who come from means, you have them sort of integrate and learn from as a social experiment from people in need. And meanwhile, the people of means are networking with one another to get better jobs. And then they do that for a few years and they leave, and then they go to places of power in policy and enforcement around, sometimes around poverty. And so this is sort of, to me, what underlies this movement. So you've got Toynbee, of the Toynbee tiles, named after his uncle, the economic historian, and the Toynbee Hall in the East End of London. This model of social reform, the settlement house, informed Jane Addams of Hull House in Chicago. And it also informed Octavia Hill, this idea of social housing and self-reliance. And the self-reliance piece is really key because that's part of both the blockchain sort of behavioral management program, automated behavioral management, which is what's coming, and the free markets, right? So you are an investor in your own human capital and your own ledger keeper. And the idea is overall improvement and self-optimization. The other thing about Octavia Hill, so I will mention, I forgot to bring this up before, But her grandfather, Thomas Southwood Smith, was actually a friend of Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, we've talked about, is both the Panopticon, the Felicitas Calculus, and the play stage, so the children can play, but they have to be powering something. And they had these ties to Robert Owen. So this is on this page. It's talking about Robert Owen's sort of socialist utopia. And Robert Owen influenced her father, and I think her father actually lost a fair bit of money being involved in Robert Owen's plans to sort of scale socialist utopias. The other aspect of this that I had forgotten to mention before was this idea that connects social reform to also militarism. And this connects to the Council for a Strong America, that Ready Nation is a part of, that included sort of athletic prowess and getting youth to be acclimated to the military and to the police and to the Protestant church and to the workforce and the Chamber of Commerce and to athleticism. These are all things that the Council for a Strong America is advancing. Let me see if I can. So these are all the things that are being pushed by the Council for a Strong America. And you can kind of see underlying this, the social reform piece. Again, be in alignment with the rules of the police, be in line with the military, be in line with the workforce, be an athlete, be Christian, be a good Christian. And all of this is integrated, and then again within an overall nationalist frame. And so what Octavia Hill did is, for sort of the kind of in line with the police athletic leagues, for those wayward youth of the poor communities, they should be directed into sort of military programs. And that was part of this Army Cadet movement in the UK that evidently still exists. And her website for her birthplace says that it has 40,000 members. And so, that's important to understand in the grand scheme of things of this. And now I just want to go over to this part of the map with Robert Owen. So, last night I was talking with Cliff a bit about the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we inhabit, and how people take our expectations of stories and invite us in, and then often can maybe turn the tables on us once we've walked into someone else's story, and then they manipulate us within that story. So I would say that Robert Owen is framed as a utopian socialist and a free thinker. He was the son-in-law of David Dale of this New Lanark, which is a model Scottish village. It was a textile, a cotton mill. And that is in line with what I've been talking about in the past about the Lowell mills and inviting the girls from the farm onto the mills and really overworking them. Now, this model town was backed by these Quaker investors, and that's really important because the Quakers keep showing up over and over again. And so it was William Allen was a Quaker pharmacist and an abolitionist, and John Walker. So the Quaker investors were helping set up New Lanark, which I think is like maybe a UNESCO heritage site. Model town. The son-in-law Robert said, okay, we have this textile business, I'd like to set up a town. He expanded on it, and he was really pushing the moral economy, and that's something that Cliff and I talked about last night, and the creation of the moral economy under AI. They were also pushing character education for the poor. Now, character education, as we know, is a huge piece in the public schools lately. In my mind, they're pushing social emotional learning and character education to get the data to train for machine learning to train the robot mind. But character education isn't new, and it went all the way back to these mill towns, and that they were paying people in labor vouchers. And so, the trick is there's a lot of folks out there who are like, blockchain, crypto, tokens, I can have my own tokens and I can make my own money, and won't it be great? And, Bernard Lietaer, we should have a whole ecology of money with all different kinds of tokens. Only if instead of talking about crypto tokens and framing it as liberation, you reframed it as script at the company store, it would feel a lot different. It would be a very different story. And so what I'm inviting you to consider is that maybe a lot of these tokens that we're going to look at in terms of an ecology of money may actually link back to sort of these sneaky moves of setting up a company town on script and then trying to call it a cooperative movement. So to me, that feels like sort of what Robert Owen was doing. He was also influenced by the spiritualist movement, Swedenborg and Mesmer, and that was very big in the early 19th century. era in the United States, and among those were the Fox sisters. They were spiritualist mediums, and they were in upstate New York during this sort of Age of Awakening, and they were hosted by Amy and Isaac Post, who were promoting them, and they were abolitionist Quakers again. So we have the Quakers showing up within the spiritualist tradition, that it was very interesting to Robert Owen, the utopian socialist thinker. Now, Robert Owen left Scotland, where this original his father-in-law's textile town was. He wanted to take the show on the road. He actually founded what's called an Owenite utopian community in Indiana, New Harmony, and he bought it from a group of pietists who relocated, I think, to the Pittsburgh area, who had been a celibate commune, and of course, all of these celibate communes generally fall apart eventually because they can't keep their numbers up due to internal reproduction, and it's a pretty limited audience for that sort of thing. So, but he took over New Harmony, and ultimately it failed. But I think that this idea of a planned utopia with industrialization, because that's what these textile mills were. This is after the Industrial Revolution has started, and the Quakers are very much major players in the advancement of the Industrial Revolution, both in ironwork and millwork and the chocolate and finance. They're very much at all levels of the Industrial Revolution. And I will say over here, one of the people who welcomed Robert Owen when he came in was Cornelius Blatchley, who was a Quaker in New York, and they were sort of surprised at the open welcome that Owen had, but I guess maybe it was also linked to the investors in the new Lanark Milltown. And so there was sort of this push, this New York Society for Promoting Communities of Ecumenicalism, and I would say this ecumenical connection, again, I don't want dissent among faith communities. I don't think that's particularly helpful, but ecumenicalism is a key for unifying the churches across this metaverse project. Now, Robert Owen had two sons who came with him to the United States. One was Richard, who became a geologist and an officer in the Civil War and the first president of Purdue University. Now, Purdue is where the sentient world simulation is based, and it's also pioneering income sharing agreements on blockchain connected to education. So that's sort of early hive mind consciousness tied to skills badging. So that's Richard Owen, who was early at Purdue, and Robert Dale Owen, who became an Indiana congressman and was involved in spiritualism and later had roles at the Smithsonian. So why is this all important besides Octavia Hill, that Octavia Hill's family was influenced by Mr. Owen and her ideas around the sort of the sanitary movement and the social reform movement and the friendly rent picker-upper and the one who is going to sort of make sure you don't have any carpet or wallpaper in your house and that you're not drinking, behind closed doors. It's that actually Alexander King was a co-founder with Aurelio Pecci of the Club of Rome in the 1970s. And he's actually a descendant of David Dale of New Lanark. So I think that's really interesting. He was a Scottish biochemist. In fact, he was the director of science at the OECD and then later founded the Club of Rome. His father, James Mitchell King, had work in the Nobel explosives and chemical industries. And one of the things he was actually interested in, the son, Alexander King, was the idea of international law, and that one way of getting towards a theory of international law would be through the global regulation of radio frequency. And that was sort of, that came out of the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. So I do believe that this link between utopianism, whether that's Skinner, Walden 2, or Robert Owen's New Lanark, this utopian imperative is something that's going to be carried through the AI and possibly even as a metaverse mind file into some sort of off-planet civilization, whatever they imagine, or maybe if not off-planet, then some other interdimensional existence that is being imagined through social impact finance and tokenization and machine readable culture that's associated, to me, it increasingly feels like, again, reinforcing what John Trudell said about a predator energy that might be sort of a technical mathematical something. I don't know if you could call it living or beingness that's really trying very hard to understand what humanity is and to taste it and possibly to gobble it all up and eat it, consume it, to become more like humans, even as imperfect and fallible as we are. So I hope that this sort of is of interest, this idea of, Octavia Hill being informed by this settlement movement, this sort of dynamic nature in the elite rubbing elbows for a brief time and networking among the poor in London's East End, where Toynbee Hall fits into that, and Arnold Toynbee, and again back to Philadelphia, which is this odd construct with these Toynbee tiles, the resurrecting the dead on planet Jupiter, and what that means, that's being laid and imprinted in Philadelphia in the pavement, in terms of sort of spell casting, and also the Charity Aid Foundation and the fact that the charity organization society that for the scientific management of poverty is now really definitely looking at blockchain. The paper that they had was called Giving Unchained. Let me see if I can bring it up, just because that's actually a really important paper. And one of these things that I saw early on, which is the reason I had really strong feelings against blockchain as any kind of tool that we would want, is that philanthropy and blockchain. See, this is 2005. I think I was bumping up against this a couple years later in 2007. But just picture that you've got the Chan Zuckerberg or the Rockefeller Foundation or the Gates Foundation or the Dell Foundation, some of these foundations that are turned into a DAO, right? And used to run these perceived, cooperatives that are actually maybe AI fascist workhouses for happiness that's monitoring for our Felicitas calculus. So anyway, sticking this in just an additive to the site visits today.
So I just wanted to take a little video, just this, we're around the other side. We're on these little tiny back streets of Philadelphia, so you can see, but you can see the brickwork. These are really, probably were sort of modest houses at the time, but this is the other side of the courtyard. And, it's historic. Okay, so we're at our next stop. We had a little bit of lunch and we're on Chestnut Street. We are in downtown Philadelphia near Independence National Park. You can sort of see that behind me. It's a brick wall area. And I had wanted to go to the Second Bank, which was one of the first central banks in the US, but it's totally covered with scaffolding. And so I decided that wouldn't be a very good backdrop. But I did just want to sort of situate ourselves that we're between 3rd Street and 4th Street on Chestnut Street. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of 3rd Street in the American banking system and the finance and the trading of different state currencies, which I think are ultimately going to be very much similar to what's coming with a monetary ecology of tokens. And so I think it all comes back here to Philadelphia, among other places, but really Philly and the idea of these trading different kinds of paper, securities that come with associated risks and profiling and risk models attached to the money. So I think that's very much about Bernard Lietaire's money ecology that he was looking at, not only fiat currency, but community currencies attached. And that was on 3rd Street. So 3rd Street is that way, and then this ahead of me is where the Second Bank that Andrew Jackson contested was, and that essentially his going back to the gold standard sort of helped initiate this economic crisis in the late 1830s in the United States. So since we couldn't go to the Second Bank, and it's all covered in scaffolding, and the First Bank, which is around the corner, is pretty much covered in wedding portrait people because it's a beautiful fall day and lots of weddings and lots of brides and grooms up on the steps of these historic buildings. I'm retreating to this sort of ugly area, which is Franklin Court. And Franklin Court was built for the bicentennial. And it's this little area, you can see this little road behind me that goes back in there. And it is the archaeological ruins of Ben and Deborah Franklin's home that were restored in the 1870, or sorry, in 1976 for the bicentennial. So that's where I'm going to go next. Okay, so we've come down this little alleyway, and it opens up into a courtyard here. You can see there's a beautiful fall tree, and I was talking with the person who's accompanying me today, and they actually do a lot of work with non-destructive testing, which is the use of, markers alongside industrial applications that are then used to create models of different sort of industrial sites, and the connection of the markers that are applied onto the landscape are coordinated through lasers with drones. And so really it's like making this wireframe diagrams of the real world, which is sort of like the metaverse. And so when I came in here, what's particularly striking about Franklin Court is the buildings that the Franklins lived in are no longer present. But what they do have are, there's some archaeological footings that have been excavated, and you can see them by looking, these little cement things. You can look in windows and see the archaeological remains, but then there are these frame structures. So we've distilled these two buildings, which are homes, down to wireframe structures. And then on top of that, they've added in the bluestone paving quotes from the family that relate to the home and its material culture. Now, this site was actually redesigned by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. And, they're all about text and sort of syntax and symbology. So if we imagine that now a home and the existence in a home has sort of been re-rendered as a series of quotes. Quotes about plates and mirrors and taking tea and visiting. And it's held within this wireframe. You can see a bit of the sky there. We've got some spraying going on today. And you've got this abstraction of a house that's represented by lines and language. And so I think that this is actually really important because when we move to the metaverse, it's not actually real. It's simply going to be a representation of information. And in that representation, they need information to be delivered efficiently. Just like if you hear Paul Glimcher of the neuroethics guy talking about the brain and the eyes processing things efficiently. It's about energy. He talks a lot in some of his presentations about the way in which the eyes are used in decision making, and that the use of the eyes in the neurons firing, the information that's coming in and how it goes to the brain is very energy intensive. That there's your brain uses up 3 times more energy than anything else in your body. And so the mind fills in the blanks about what it's seeing in shortcut ways. And so we can imagine how that might apply to this idea of extended reality or spatial computing, that these processing systems are not unlike a brain, right? And so they want, latency, access, data transmission, and organization are all still relevant, even if it's an artificial brain versus a real brain. And so imagine sort of living a life where things get reduced to their barest essentials, these bare minimums, right? The outline, the text, the hypertext, the metadata, and that you're supposed to sort of fill in the rest with your imagination, I think, maybe one of the ways that goes. So I'm going to sit down a minute and I'm going to read a passage out of a book that's actually about Anthony Drexel. And Anthony Drexel, his father was a portrait painter, so again, someone who's making an alternate reality, and he traveled to Latin America, but in traveling from Latin America and back to the United States, he had to deal with currency transitions, and then he got the grand idea of beginning to work in currency trading. And he started a currency trading business in Louisville at one point, and then his wife said, that's too far from Philadelphia, you have to come home, and so he set up a business on 3rd Street. And 3rd Street is just this half block from us, and 3rd Street is where these papers were traded. And when I read these sections out of this book, it's a biography of Anthony Drexel, who happened to be the mentor to J.P. Morgan and JP Morgan is central in the human capital finance space, I think you'll start to see maybe how trading of diverse debt instruments and trading instruments of paper relates to the Bancor protocol and the coming of trading the token. So I left one of the hearts under the tree, and we'll go look at that in a minute. I did forget to mention, so the importance of Ben Franklin. Of course, he was a founding father. He was part of Freemasonry. That's an important thing to know about. And also his livelihood, as far as being a diplomat and a civil person and a scientist, was printing, right? Printing. He ran a printing press, and the actual buildings that are still there in front are interpreted as his printing office, and his business. And when we were looking in the display about St. John Newman, up on Gerrard Street, they had one of these Bibles that was the Casey Bible, and it was done in cooperation with Ben Franklin's printing company. So the imprinting is part of the coding, right? And soon, imprinting also, I think, Sebs has done some research into the idea of like the chip manufacturing and lithography, and the idea of printing books is not unlike printing chips that then imprint us with the ideas that are fed through the imprinting device, and that varies, and then eventually the imprinting device may change substantially with the coding that's happening with optics and photonics, and it may look very different than what we understand as an imprinting mechanism that is delivered through a book or a device like this phone or something else, that the imprinting actually could just simply come on like heterodyning and carrier waves. And so I wanted to take a minute just to impress upon you that Ben Franklin's, the fact that he was both involved in Freemasonry, which knew a lot about symbolism and ritual, and connected to all of that is important, and that we are really just half a block from 3rd Street where the paper trading was, and that also on 3rd Street is the building where the Chemical Heritage Foundation is. Chemistry and radioisotopes and track and tracing are all central part of this, the way in which the chemical corporations have insinuated themselves into our lives and usurping natural systems, and are coming now into the sort of whole syn-bio-nano era. And so that's like within this block that we're in. And then also right next to Independence Hall on the other side of the second bank is actually the American Philosophical Society. And the American Philosophical Society is essentially the repository of American scientific history. Like the most esteemed scientists of the 18th century and 19th century are sort of anointed there. The collections are there. And in addition to their collections of early Americana and science are also collections of indigenous language. And I think that's really, really vital. It's about indigenous cosmology, putting those into a computational form. So I'm going to read a little bit. This book is called The Man Who Made Wall Street by Dan Rottenberg, I think is a local Philadelphian, Anthony J. Drexel, and the Rise of Modern Finance. And so do those folks over at Wharton know what they're doing? Like, have they spent a lot of time sort of looking into what 19th century finance was like and how it relates to blockchain and crypto and tokens? I would be interested to know that. If any of you guys know about business folks who are interested in history, I would love to know if they're making connections between Philadelphia of the 1830s and the cryptocurrency trading today that's going to be coming through Bancor with smart contracting like Mr. Griggs and Cello's Beautiful Money. So again, Drexel is JP Morgan's mentor. JP Morgan was sort of a wayward guy at the time, and Drexel took him under his wing and made him what he was. Drexel, at the end of his life, founded a university. Drexel University is in West Philadelphia. It's adjacent to the University of Pennsylvania, so those two are sort of right close to each other. It's known as more of a technical school, but it also does cooperative, work-based cooperatives. And the digital badge program, the digital on-ramp program that was initially sponsored by IBM here in the city in, I believe, 2012, it didn't go anywhere at the time because it wasn't its time. Like, we didn't have digital identity. We didn't have ubiquitous spatial computing yet. But it didn't actually disappear. The digital on-ramp program actually went to go into sort of mothballs at Drexel University. And Drexel University also, individuals associated with the university had a major role in developing RFID technology, so supply chain trip tracking technology. Keep all of this in mind in the background as you listen to these sections that I'm going to read. Trading in currencies, or quote-unquote money shaving, as it was then called, was a risky occupation at the best of times. But it was far more perilous when Francis Drexel first got into it. Since the founding of the Republic in 1776, paper currency had been issued not by the federal government, but by individual chartered banks. In effect, these banks were legally empowered to issue their own notes, a privilege that required the issuing bank to redeem those notes in specie, gold or silver or some equivalent, on demand. Just as banks today issue credit cards to save customers the inconvenience of carrying cash, so the early American banks issued notes to spare customers their need to carry gold and silver. Okay, so the trading in currency, right? Gold and silver trading. It goes on to say, all but one of these early note issuing banks operated under state charters, and their notes invariably declined in value as they crossed state lines, just as, say, Canadian dollars today circulate with less alacrity in Boston than in Toronto. The only national bank was the Bank of the United States from 1791 to 1811, and its successor, the Second Bank of the United States, which was from 1816 to 1836. Both of them were headquartered in Philadelphia, and they're both on either end. One is on 4th Street, and one is on 3rd Street, and one is on 5th Street, along Chestnut, really close. This bank, the Second Bank, was a joint partnership of the federal government and private stockholders, and was created to handle government transactions, hold federal deposits, and issue banknotes at branch offices across the country. Under the leadership of the Renaissance Philadelphian Nicholas Biddle, this de facto central bank generally stabilized banking conditions and currency rates from one state to another. But to President Andrew Jackson, the Second Bank of the United States represented a dangerous concentration of money power, competing unfairly with state-chartered banks. Quote, "I do not dislike your bank any more than all banks," Jackson naively informed Biddle, "but ever since I read the history of the South Sea Bubble, I have been afraid of banks." The bubble to which he referred was a speculative hoax that had ruined many English investors in 1720. In 1832, Jackson vetoed the renewal of the Second Bank's national charter, causing it to expire in 1836. The bank continued to function until 1841, but only under a state charter. And so thus, after 1836, the only incorporated banks in the country, and consequently, the only banks issuing notes, were those holding state charters. Yet Jackson and his advisors had grown suspicious not only of the Bank of the United States, but of paper money per se, which they blamed for causing alternating cycles of inflation and depression. Unable to persuade Congress to restrict the circulation of banknotes in July 1836, Jackson, on his own authority, issued the Species Circular, requiring payment in gold or silver for all public lands. His aim was to bolster the soundness of currency, but he accomplished precisely the opposite. Suddenly, gold and silver virtually disappeared from circulation, to be replaced by paper notes of dubious value. Western banks, unable to meet the sudden demand for gold and silver, began to fail one after the other, and by the spring of 1837, the entire country was gripped in the first major financial depression. And so right around 1837 was when John Newman, the German priest, came to New York, and then eventually made his way via upstate New York and Maryland to become the Bishop of Philadelphia in the 1850s. The surviving state-chartered bank had a hard time meeting their legal requirement to come up with the necessary gold or silver to redeem notes on demand, so the value of their notes varied widely from place to place, generally falling more and more below face value as the notes moved farther from their place of issue. As long as the United States lacked a uniform bank currency, a lively trade in buying and selling the rash of paper money in circulation persisted. Some dealers and newspapers published guides, which they updated regularly, reporting the value of the many banknotes in circulation. By maintaining a liquid secondary market for banknotes, that is, providing assurance that a holder could always find a buyer for his note at some price, these currency brokers enhanced the value of the dubious paper currency then in circulation. In this respect, they were just as important to the health of the nation's economy in the 1830s and 40s, and bondbrokers became in the 20th century. Right? So imagine thinking about all of these currencies being traded at different rates depending on their geographic location. So think geofencing, right? And satellite tracking and tracking of currency, right? Digital currency, tracking, and then making a prediction about the value of that currency depending on its quality, right? And all of that being done through AI quantum computers. Now, that's where we're going, I think, with these tokens. So Francis Drexel opened this currency exchange in Louisville, and like he had various contacts. It's not known exactly why he chose Louisville, but I think it said that it could have been because they required the gold backing, that Louisville was well centered at the sort of opening of the western lands at that point, such as they were in Ohio, and that they could get gold and silver from Mexico up the Mississippi in 5 days. So it was like an auspicious location. But his wife was not that crazy about Louisville, and so he said he really had to come home to Philadelphia. And then so he brought his sons into the business, who were young teenagers. Within 2 years, Francis would bring his son Anthony, then just 13 years old, into the currency business. 32 years after that, Anthony would beckon Pierpont Morgan to his monumental mission in life. But on that day, Francis Drexel set aside his palette, his painting palette, and opened his currency brokerage along the Louisville waterfront. He had no thought of changing the world. He was simply struggling to survive, as he had been doing instinctively for 28 years. Okay, so the painter turns currency trader along with his sons. So then he had to come home, and it says he found success as a Louisville currency broker, and his Philadelphia-born wife, Catherine, insisted he return to her hometown. So at the beginning of 1838, after less than a year in Louisville, Francis opened a currency office in a narrow 14-foot wide building at 34 South 3rd Street, in the heart of Philadelphia's financial district, and just around the corner from Nicholas Biddle's ill-fated Second Bank of the United States. And that's pretty much where we're at, very close. Late each winter, why 3rd Street? So late each winter, merchants from the western and southern states journeyed to Market Street in Philadelphia to purchase their goods for the coming year. They paid for this merchandise with the paper notes issued by home banks, the Red Dog money of Michigan, the Wildcat money of Mississippi, and the Canal scrip of Indiana, for example, which was generally as despised as their names imply. These currencies were valid at the issuing bank, but were considered uncurrent, that is, unredeemable beyond 100 miles from home. Thus, issuing banks used every means to keep their notes in circulation as far from home as possible, and traveling merchants who received these notes were constantly devising schemes to get rid of them. The quickest way to do so was to sell the notes to currency brokers. So Philadelphia's brokers waited on 3rd Street to buy and sell this uncurrent money at a sizable discount, given the risks involved. Years later, a former counting house boy for one of the Market Street wholesale houses described the process as it worked in 1838. I would be given a package of money consisting of notes of all denominations and sometimes from all states of the Union. I would go into 3rd Street and from one broker to another and finally sell to the one whose bid was the highest. Francis M. Drexel had been operating on 3rd Street for less than a year, but left a favorable impression on this boy. And so he talks about, it says nice things about Drexel. Let's see. Dealing in uncurrent money wasn't the 3rd Street broker's only activity. Since the concept of borrowing to finance a business wasn't yet accepted, much business was conducted on credit. That is, businesses furnishing IOUs to their suppliers in lieu of cash. Unlike uncurrent banknotes, these so-called country checks and notes of hand were similarly bought and sold freely in 3rd Street. This business of Francis M. Drexel's was barely 2 years old, and his sons Francis A. and Anthony were only 15 and 13. When the boys' formal education ended and they went to work as clerks in their father's office in 1839. Unlike his own father, Anthony was never one to question his father's plans for his future. From that point on, Anthony's cultural and business education alike would be confined to his father's office and his home under the direct supervision of his father. By 1844, the nation had finally recovered from the panic of 1837. Now the U.S. economy shifted into a new expansive era, stimulated by European demand for American cotton and grain and by the first boom in railroad construction. Francis M. Drexel had not only survived the Depression. As he accumulated more capital, he slowly and cautiously expanded the firm's service. He began buying and selling not only banknotes, but also domestic and foreign bills of exchange, the standard instruments then used to finance trade and commerce. A bill of exchange was a written commitment to pay a specified sum to the bearer at a fixed future date. Usually the seller of some goods would draw a bill of exchange from a buyer in order to give him credit for a few months, thus allowing the buyer to delay payment until the goods had arrived and been sold in turn to a retail or manufacturer. Brokers like Francis Drexel provided a secondary market for these bills, as they did for banknotes. So what's not being said, and what happens so often in these conversations, is the merchandise that they're talking about in many cases was actually enslaved African people. I mean, that was among the merchandise, because at this time there was a shift from agriculture in the tidewater of tobacco to moving people down to the deep south, to Mississippi and Alabama, for the sugar plantations and the cotton plantations. And so they were taking whole families from the Maryland, Virginia tidewater and pulling them down into the deep south. And that was cross-state borderline currency. And so these third-party holders of the bills of lading, these notes of exchange, were central both in Philadelphia and in New York. And so I strongly believe that the blockchain system, blockchain identity, and this idea of learn card and education as a new currency, backing our currency with our futures trading on our work, meaning our mental capacity, whether that be our emotional data, our cognitive data that we be used as part of a cloud mined computing service, that is actually, this education on the blockchain is the 21st century metaverse version of bills of exchange notes on enslaved human capital that were at that time used for the harvest of tobacco, corn, tobacco, sugar, and cotton. It's a direct connection, guys. I mean, it's clearly a direct connection, and yet everyone wants to dance around and pretend that that's not what's happening. And I'm not meaning to say that necessarily having a learn card and being compelled to put your brain in a cloud mind is exactly an equivalency of enslaved Africans being brutalized and murdered and worked to death on plantations. And it's not exactly the same thing in that way, but the structure, the new manifestation of the structure, and it's no surprise that this is going after low-income communities, black and brown children who are targeted as at risk or underperforming or closing the gap and closing the digital divide. They need to close all of that to get everyone on blockchain for this cloud mind consciousness. So anyway, I guess that's what I have to say about 3rd Street and about the Second Bank and about Anthony Drexel and about digital badging and Drexel University, which is at the bleeding edge of a lot of gaming development too, and high-tech emerging technology and information management. And that these are all things that we should be thinking about as we continue down this road that's clearly been set for at least 200 years. And so now I left a little offering. You can see those buildings in the distance. That's where the print houses are interpreted. Here we have the ghost houses and the metadata. I will say the other interesting thing, I'm going to mention it because next we're going to go to Cesium, and they're actually building out the metaverse in the computing side of things. But someone had shared with me this idea that now Pantone is charging a subscription fee service to access colors in its palette. And through Adobe, I think. And Adobe is a central player in file compression software, and is the anchor tenant in Silicon Slopes outside of Salt Lake City. And imagine what that's going to mean if the idea is that we live in an extended reality where people who don't have the money for a subscription have to live in a black and white world, and that people who have access to all the tokens through either their social status or their behavioral compliance, then you get to live your life in color, in living color, right? And you know, if you've ever been to a youth hostel or someplace where you have to a campground, you have to put quarters in for warm water in your shower. You get the cold water is free, but if you want a warm shower, you have to pay. And I feel like that's the direction that we're going. So this idea of the ghost house and something that's only minimally provided, only the most minimal information, because the computational system can only take the wireframe version that maybe is monitored with tags and sensor devices and monitored by the drones and their laser outlays to give you an outline of the thing, but not the fully manifesting, just the ruined ghosts of the thing is important. So, and there's this beautiful, we're beautiful fall color. I can't quite tell. It almost looks like this is a mulberry tree, but I can't imagine they would have planted a mulberry tree here. But just, giving my little offering. This is one of the little ladies my friend and I made in Virginia when we went, we did our excursions, our field visits in Virginia. And so I had 2 others that I've left along the way. Actually, I gave one to Eve, and so this is the one I have. I need to make some more, but I thought that I would leave her here with the flowers of peace from Cliff, and then this is a heart made by a friend of the friend that I made the dolls with, and we have some lichen, and I have the dandelions there. So I used, I have my sweetgrass with me and my piece of my log, and I did a little tuning with the frequency bowl before we left. So I think the last spot that we'll go is probably going to be the Cesium, building the metaverse, and that'll be our conclusion for the day. Yeah. So this is the press. How old is this particular?
The one down there is from 1976.
Oh, okay. So when they made this.
Yeah, when this became a printing office. This is an 18th century building. The wall that's behind my coworker and I is older than Independence Hall. It's from 1722, so it's 300. And then the wall behind you is from 1787.
Right. Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we're walking to the next place. We're going to Cesium, by the way. We're going to see if we can get in the Curtis building to see a Dream Garden. But this is the second bank. You can see that it's all under wraps. It's now a portrait gallery with the National Park Service, but this was the second bank in 2 iterations. I think it was done after 1837, or it continued as a state charter. And all of the people, there's some quite beautiful buildings here on Chestnut Street that are later, but banking buildings. You can see this is the 1850s, so this is after the second bank was done. But lots and lots of banking power here, and some beautiful buildings, and we're in the middle of the tourist area, so beautiful day, carriage rides and all of this, but people don't actually have an understanding of the way in which the financial system, the structural system of domination is coming, and it's all framed as feel-good liberty democracy. All right, so here we are behind the American Philosophical Society. So the second bank is here for context, right next to us, and then on this side in that block is Independence Hall, and over there is the Liberty Bell. So that's where we're situated, and this is a statue of the signer. And I would just sort of put this idea, like, look at the heroic, like the pen and the paper and the contract, right? The social contract. And understand if maybe that social contract was actually made by Freemasons for some reason that we don't quite appreciate, right? And like, we're living under a code, and so the stories we've all been told is that this is the good story. Like, this is the good story, and then we go to other countries and we bring this story to other countries by brute force, often to profit defense contracting interests and other financial interests and creative destruction through war, and then we bring the democracy, and then this new version of democracy is going to be augmented with tokens. And here we're going to tell you that you're radically participating by giving you a pile of tokens to vote on things you don't know about, and then to ask you to give those tokens to the AI so the AI can be your representative. And we're in the middle of election season right now, and if you listen to me, you realize that I'm kind of post any sort of political ideology. The whole system is not what we were told, in my opinion. But if we think about Ben Franklin and the printing press and paper and codes and smart law, and the idea that the most esteemed institutions in our country, like Yale, they've had these smart contract law conferences on blockchain for the past 8 years. And is anybody telling you about that? Is anybody talking about augmented democracy? I don't think so. And what does that mean? Because the Philosophical Society themselves, they were holding on to the indigenous languages, right? Because that is another model. In some ways, they claim that they base some of the the ideals on the Onondaga, I think there's some questions that Stephen Newcomb would have about that. But there's this alternate cosmology that's sort of locked up in this building in that language. And they've sold us a story. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but in reality, everything I seem to see leads me to believe that there's more going on than would appear on the surface. You can see in the distance there, that's the Roman Haas building. I went out to the Haas estate out in Villanova, so that was their headquarters in the 60s. There's a lot of stories that are left untold, and if we're going to actually have agency in this game, we need to look around our backyard and learn what the real, what the, I was going to say real is a coded language, but what are the other storylines that get left out? So we're in the Curtis Publishing Building. Independence Hall is just on the other side of the street from here. And we've come into the lobby. It's an office building. This is a mural. This mural is a very well-known mural. It's called Dream Garden. And it was commissioned by the head of the Curtis Publishing Company, which was a very important early 20th century publisher, Ladies' Home Journal, Jack and Jill magazine, a lot of notable publications. He commissioned this mural from Maxfield Parish, and it was executed by Tiffany in Tiffany glass. I think it's about 100,000 individual pieces of glass in over 260 colors. And it was finished in 1916. At one point around, I think in the, like 20 years ago, there was a threat to remove the mural and put it under private sale. I think Steve Wynn, who the real estate developer and luxury casino operator, had intended to purchase the mural and relocate it. And at that point, the Pew Charitable Trust acquired it and named it the city's first historic object. Again, Pew Charitable Trust is very central to the human capital What Works impact market. And so it's interesting that they were the ones who acquired it for the city. And, you know, I just want to go in a little bit closer so there's some, you can see the tiling, the detail of the mural itself, and it's quite incredible. And, you know, if you just think for a moment about what I was saying about the subscription color service for colors, and then if you don't pay the subscription, then certain colors get turned into black. And, you know, to me, some of what Cliff and I were talking about last night, about what story, what are you listening to, what story are you in? Do you recognize that you have agency over the stories that you're listening to and the story that you tell yourself and others around you? I think that this idea of the dream garden, it's really interesting to me because it feels like, you know, they want to invite you into a story of bliss, and that is the metaverse. They want to craft a beautiful place that's so much nicer than the real world. You know, we were walking over across Independence Hall, which is all, you know, gated off with security guards, and, you know, as we did, there were clearly several groups of unhoused people who were folding up their blankets and picking up their bags for the day to make their way to try to find some shelter for the night. And they want to make the real world really, really terrible so that they can, you know, invite you into the dream. And the dream is, you know, as I mentioned, I feel like it's sort of the Satan's proposal. And for people who don't know better, it might be attractive, right? It might be attractive, but I feel like this, maybe this laughing figure, you know, in the mountain, like the last laugh is on us, because at some point, you know, our UBI runs out and we don't have, you know, the highlights on the sides of that mountain, you know, those shades of colors are custom, you know, they just go to black or gray. And then the dream quickly becomes not a dream anymore. In this beautiful nature, you know, there is the plan that ultimately most of nature, I think, will be inaccessible to people, to regular people, and to indigenous peoples whose original homelands they were, and that they will be set aside as some sort of reserve. And, you know, in those reserves, we'll be expecting that all of the animals wear heart monitors to pay for the drone surveillance, and then we turn the dream over to the AI, and then the you know, the interesting sort of weird fractal AI art that happens. You know, the AI takes over in its artistic sentiment. So, where are the artists? Where are the artists at this time? What role do the arts have? What role do the arts have to play? Where are the storytellers? Where are the artists? Because it's important. It's important that we situate this with the right frame. That we're being invited into a dream garden, but the dream garden isn't real. It's not real. What are we listening to? Okay, on to Cesium. Cesium that is building the simulacra. Cesium that is knitting together extended reality. Okay, it's starting to get dark. We walked about 5 blocks from the Curtis Publishing Building with the Dream Garden, and now we're on 11th Street. And on the 3rd floor of this building, so I guess in that area, is the office of Cesium. And Cesium, I guess, is an element. It's used in the atomic clocks. And this company is actually a central company in developing the systems for the open metaverse. So I'm going to take a minute and just sort of do a little bit more deconstruction on that. But since I'm in the middle of a busy street corner, I'm going to tuck in next door. There's a little courtyard with some seating, and we'll tell you a little bit more about it. Okay, we were noticing this is a lot of new development here on Ludlow Street between 11th and 12th. This is all sort of new construction, newly renovated buildings. And you can see the WeWork space right there. So WeWork didn't go away. I think WeWork may have some plans for us for a tokenized gig work kibbutz program. So this is sort of where we're going, and you can see there is money. Like in some of these places, there is a lot of money. If you open the taps for redevelopment after the creative destruction, it's ready, and you have room for glamorous buildings and fancy ways of living. If you are someone who is inclined to go along with the program, go along with the metaverse program. So you can, the few who are able to really facilitate this transformation, they'll be living sort of a fancy lifestyle, and the rest of us will be doing gig work in VR headsets in casita cargo containers. Okay, so we're in this little courtyard around the corner from the Cesium building. I just want to show you, I printed this off before. This is about the Pantone colors being part of the subscription process, right? So this is the future of the Dream Garden that goes black and white if you don't have enough tokens. So this is real, and and this is also just a form that talks a little bit about the pricing. It's subscription. Everything is as a service. Even the casitas they were talking about, like, we're housing as a service. And so Cesium as a company, again, they're on South 11th Street here in Philadelphia, and they're working on geospatial work and rendering for all kinds of things. So for digital twins, for games, for military, for industrial relations, and they're bridging what they say the digital and the physical world. They're doing open standard, that's the key. Like, they're going to want to sell us on the open metaverse, open standards, and then they're doing a lot of research into the metaverse itself. They're working closely with many of the major companies, including NVIDIA. This is a little printout I have of the NVIDIA work that they're doing. They're at many conferences talking about the open metaverse, because ultimately they need open standards, because everyone needs to code the metaverse to make this new manifest destiny, build the new empire. Like, we will be like the coding version of moving the giant stones into place for the pyramids, right? There needs to be massive numbers of people mobilized all over the world to build out this thing, to code this thing into reality. And so it has to be open, clearly. And in those open standards, I think there will be a lot of workforce development. Here, they have an article that's talking about the real world and the internet merging through geospatial information. Here's building the open metaverse. So that's their plan, the open metaverse. So keep your eye out for open. Again, open source doesn't automatically mean this is the good witch, it could be other stuff. And they're using these geospatial systems for all sorts of things, measuring weather, interactive virtual reality for real estate discovery, high resolution photogrammetry. I mean, every single kinds of thing, but also, here they're working with epic games. So my friend today, I keep saying, like, we're in a game. We have to understand, maybe you can disagree with me, but rather than being enslaved, I think we're agents in the game. We are folks in the game. So on that note, though, I do want to mention slavery, because I forgot when I was over at Octavia Hill that there was a section I wanted to read about George Fox, who is the founder of Quakerism. And, as a Philadelphian and someone who has absorbed a lot of mythology of what the Quakers are about, I've been deconstructing that about the finance interests behind Quakers and their sort of corporate mentality and networking back in the 18th century, and the fact that they were doing some sort of dirty dealings back in the day. Mr. Galton and his malfunctioning rifles, and selling arms, and the Barclay Bank backing the slave trade, paper trail anyway. But I found an article when I was getting ready this morning from a professor at Swarthmore, and it was about our understanding of George Fox's anti-slavery legacy and sort of the truth of it. And what he's saying in this article, and it's very extensive, was essentially that the Quakers were looking to grow their church just like all the churches, and they were looking for wealthy benefactors, and they were more than happy to look the other way often at what was actually going on. And so when he traveled to Barbados and he was meeting with family friends, he would look aside of the slavery that was happening and imagine that it was just indentured servitude, or it was something nicer than what it actually was. And almost that the Quakers were doing their good work as Christians by sort of Christianizing and bringing the people who had been enslaved into the Christian church. So I just want to read a couple paragraphs to give you a sense of this, and how this relates to the patriarchy and the control of the household. What happens when your friendly rent agent or your friendly pastor becomes an AI with actuators and sensors that can actually compel you into the behavior it deems optimal? Fox's reaction to slavery stemmed from his patriarchal views of the family. He cited scriptural texts from Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Joshua, showing the responsibility of the father/master to call together his family/household for worship and to enforce right order. All, whether strangers, heathens, servants — Fox did not apply the term slaves to blacks in the gospel family order — were in Israel's covenant and must stand before God's judgment. The New Testament dispensation reinforced the father's duty to control family behavior and gave responsibility to them to preach the gospel. Christ, proclaimed Fox, died for Tawns, blacks, Turks, barbarians, and whites, and freed all from spiritual bondage. Fox may have been distressed at the moral failures brought about by slavery, but he did not see them as intrinsic to the institution. And this is the thing, people are making like good and evil about individual acts, and they're not looking at the structures. And what I'm asking today, and what I'm trying to do by going around and telling these stories, is it's imperative that we knit this together and look at the structure as a whole. Of Fox's companions in 1671, William Edmondson, John Burnyeat, and Elizabeth Houghton left information on their reaction to Barbados. Burnyeat, who joined Fox on the mainland and had visited the island for 7 weeks in 1664 and the summer of 1667, and for 6 months in 1670, wrote epistles to the white Quaker inhabitants, which never mentioned the slave population. The closest Burnyeat came to anti-slavery was an epistle written in 1670, condemning holding a fast day to end an epidemic. And such who, instead of setting the oppressed free of undoing the heavy burthens and make yokes instead of breaking them, are not the people of the Lord, will accept in their fasts. Edmondson said only that in Barbados we had many large and precious meetings, and many were brought into the way of life and peace with God. He talks about here meeting the needs of slaves served only to help the white planters. Houghton was more indignant about the Anglican persecution of Friends on the island than over the treatment of Negroes. Lydia Fell's tract to the inhabitants of Barbados, published in 1676, denounced persecution of Quakers and exhorted friends to hold the purity of the light. She too did not discuss the slave population. Between 1671 and 1682, George Fox sent several epistles to friends in areas with significant slave populations, including Barbados. He remained concerned with the religious training of black servants, but never addressed their eventual freedom. He does not appear to have ever questioned the legitimacy of slavery. And so these are the same areas that John Templeton of these Templeton mutual funds left. John Templeton gave up his U.S. citizenship, became a citizen of the Crown, was knighted by the Queen, and went to the Bahamas. And that's where he set up, that's where he lived the rest of his life, with his foundation to study managed population and genius and free markets and theoretical physics and religion. So I think we have to ask ourselves, is Cesium building an open metaverse dream garden on a subscription model? And what does that mean? Are we to be enslaved in that? Are we to be indentured servants into that? Are we to live under the control of an AI social worker, God, overseer? Because I think that this is the game that they're playing, and it behooves us to really pay attention and to consider this game very thoughtfully before we enter it, not just for ourselves, but for the people who are coming after. So we're just walking to the bus stop, and I did want to just take a break because on the way to the bus stop this is the Comcast building that's behind us, the Comcast headquarters. There's two buildings here. This is the one that's the first headquarters, and then this thing that I'm around is the second headquarters, and you can see clearly how sustainable it is with all of the light. And I was hoping that we could get in and see some of the public art, because the last time I was here, it was all about you had to have a mask to get in, but there's like a security guard right at the door, so I'm assuming that that's a no-go. But the lights above there are running text, and again, like almost spell casting, right? And as we came up, it actually was talking about we shall have imaginary gardens with real toads in them in the meantime. And wow, that's quite an impression, right? Imaginary gardens, and we were just talking about the dream garden and Cesium making the open metaverse. And I'll just show inside so the art is running along the ceiling, and there's this set of sort of fractal-like shapes going down into the lobby. I think there's quite a bit of public art in this building. It's a very expensive building. There's probably a lot of public art. And I think there's even like a 3D viewing circle or something like that. But yeah, just waiting for the bus. And look, if the open metaverse is run, it's run by your telecommunications and your cable TV company. So we've got Verizon and Comcast here, spellcasting towards the metaverse. Okay, one less entry. We're standing, waiting for the bus, waiting for the 48 back to Fairmount. And I realized I haven't talked about Arch Street Presbyterian Church yet. It's right behind me with the little red doors. It's this little bitty church, and it's between these giant Comcast buildings on one side and the other side. It's like the little building in between. And I wanted just to note that the pastor of Arch Street Presbyterian his name is Bill Golderer. And Bill Golderer is currently the president of the United Way. And I've mentioned repeatedly that the United Way is behind the collective impact and the poverty management and the human capital finance. And again, Golderer, how do you get profit out of poverty? Well, you create an impact finance market. Bill Golderer actually was a founder of the Broad Street Ministry, which is services for unhoused people, and then is very well connected. And so that's important, that the faith community being connected to the United Way. Also, I think he went to SMU, which is Texas, and a lot going on there with that. And I would just mention Presbyterian John Templeton, that I spoke about previously of the Templeton Foundation, was Presbyterian as well. So in addition to all these different facets of faith communities, right, we have the Vatican, we have the Quakers, we have the Unitarians, we have the LDS, we have Swedenborgians, but also the Presbyterians. And the particular aspect that is linked into the Presbyterians is John Templeton. And this idea of what money will teach you how to pray. So what does that say? We really should familiarize ourselves with collective impact and what the United Way is doing in our communities around poverty, because I'll bet you dollars to donuts that it has involved some data dashboards and some sensors. Won't you be my sensor? Yeah, come live inside the robot. All right, bye. Thanks for spending the day with us, guys.